Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Friday, March the 13th, 2026. We got another Friday the 13th. That's fun. And today we are doing a total pest breakdown show. While my voice is obviously still recovering, we're going to keep my current talking to a minimum and let some of my older talking do a little bit of work. So today's episode, we've gathered some segments on common garden pests, growing squash without bugs, that is a thing, pests you can't exclude, and even get a little cameo from our friend Jayne Merner of the Composter podcast to talk about pests in the compost. So let's do it. All right, Patreon member Scott Williamson says that he no-till farms a quarter acre, and his garden pests include whiteflies, gophers, and slugs, and asks, what can I use to get rid of them organically? Thank you for your help. Well, obviously nothing is going to treat all three, really. I mean, not anything that would leave you with a farm left after using it, at least. For gophers, which I should note are not an issue here in Kentucky, but we have things like tornadoes and floods and deer and humidity and stuff, so don't get too envious. But for gophers, you have a few options. Burying gopher fence can help. When I visited my friends at Ojai Roots in Southern California this past April, they showed me some black gopher wire fencing that they are burying around their fruit trees and gardens at I think like 2 to 3 feet deep, if I remember correctly. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see what that looks like a little bit. That's pretty intense and expensive on a large scale, but on a small scale could be helpful. Also, gopher traps like the gopher hawk do seem to help based on the conversations I've had with growers. Habitat for hawks and such might also be helpful as well as potentially cats, but also Dachshunds or terrier dogs could be of assistance. So I guess money, time, and pets is kind of the answer for gophers. The big problem there, as I see it, is that gophers like what gardens offer, tender plants and roots, but also potentially insects, worms, etc., as they are opportunistic omnivores, although they are technically herbivores. It's like a deer here in the drought. Our deer pressure is low in a wet season when they have a lot to eat out in the wild, but in a drought, they fixate on our gardens because that is where the moisture is, and effectively the moisture-rich plants. For gophers, it's the same thing. They are hard on gardens in dry climates because that's where the goodies are. Perhaps that's a little obvious and may not be helpful to controlling them, but maybe that perspective is helpful to those who have the water and land to potentially create alternative areas to their gardens for gophers to do their thing elsewhere. As for slugs, if it's an acute problem, you could consider Sluggo. It's an approved organic product, although I've never used it. I've heard it is effective. I like beer traps for myself for slugs if the issue is confined to a small area. Place a cup of beer inside of a live trap that's closed so no big critters can get into it and party in your garden. Anyway, place that near where the issue is overnight and you will find loads of dead, drunk slugs in the morning, which is a delicacy in some countries. Kidding. Probably. For whiteflies, which whiteflies suck, sorry that you have them, but for whiteflies, make sure there is plenty of diverse flowering habitat for beneficials because whiteflies have a lot of predators like lacewings and some lady beetles. You can also purchase and release those sorts of things like lacewings and lady beetles, though that comes with other complications that we'll get into another time. Remove infected leaves as soon as you see the issue developing. Neem oil and pyrethrin are also potential organic options for treating outbreaks. My general advice, however, when you have to treat an acute issue with something like that, like a spray of some sort, is to spray 2 positive things like a compost tea or extract or nutrient solution for every negative pest killing treatment you use. So 2 positives for every negative. And I just say negative, meaning like its intention is not to build life, but to remove it. Negative. Exclusionary pest netting or insect netting, I believe, can help, but that's not as helpful later in the plant's life because if it is, say, tomatoes, then you need pollinators to be able to access those flowers. But perhaps some insect netting will allow you to get them established, to get the plants established. Diversity and improving soil health will always help, but I find nothing less helpful than when people say, fix your soil and it will fix your pest issues or disease issues. And that's because, well, one, I mean, gophers don't care. And 2, quote unquote, fixing your soil is incredibly contextual and can take many years in some contexts. I've had soils that I fixed, so to speak, in a few months, while certain parts of my current land where the clay is thick and old and compacted, frankly, feel like they don't want anything to do with being fixed. They're just stubborn things. When I get old and deplete, I will probably be the same way, so at least they have my respect. That's the vibe those plots are giving me, sort of the, clay is the ornery old fart of soil types. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, I hope that's at least somewhat helpful, Scott. There is no easy answer to pest management. It's usually multiple layers of things that you have to do or need to do differently. However, if you have other things that have worked for you on slugs, whiteflies, and or gophers, listener, let us know in the comments or at the forum. Be right back.
Today's episode is brought to you by Grown By. Grow smarter with Grown By, the farmer-owned cooperative. Grown By is the platform for online sales of everything. Custom and traditional CSAs, halves of beef, flower bouquets, wholesale to restaurants, and now Grown By supports in-person sales too. With their new app, Grown By Register, you can supercharge your market and farm stand, finally bringing together your online and offline sales and customer data. Grown By is proud to make local food accessible by processing SNAP benefits online and in person right within the app. Grown By helps you to put your best food forward. Schedule a demo today at coop.grownby.com/no-till. That's coop.grownby.com/no-till. All right, back to the show.
Today's Patreon question comes from Casista DVM, who asks, quote, how long after transplanting do you keep your winter squash under netting to prevent borers? Until the female flowers show up? End quote. Okay, great question. So I'm just going to turn this into a segment on our squash growing strategy in general because it all kind of deals with pest management. Though I should say that I have less trouble with winter squash and pests than I do with summer squash and pests, the vine borer, squash bugs, any of it. But the strategy is more or less the same, in fact, for all of those pests. All right, so everything starts with good soil, obviously, and especially for squash. They love fertility, like a lot. I know I've said this before, but there's a reason the best pest-free squash you will ever grow is in your compost pile. Squash loves compost. So anyway, bed preparation and making sure there's a good high-quality compost involved is the first place to start with pest protection when it comes to summer and winter squash alike. Next, we start almost all of our squash in wind strips or soil balls or whatever makes sense for keeping the roots from touching for you. The touching of the root is not the problem. The problem is the disturbing of cucurbit roots when you go to plant them after they have intertwined a bit. They don't like that disturbance. If you ever see leaves curl and die at the tips after you transplant them, that's generally why. It's too much root disturbance. So be careful to ensure they get off on the right foot by being gentle with the transplants. And then when you do transplant them, make sure they are going into nice, moist soil. I always put a wet blob of nice compost at the bottom of the transplant hole just to give them a healthy jump start. Just make sure it's good finished compost. Otherwise, it could have the opposite effect of giving them a good jump start, like giving them a good death probably. You could also just start them from seed planted directly into a nice blob of compost in the garden as opposed to seedling trays, as long as the bed is free of weeds, right? Because if you germinate them in the tunnel, then you skip that whole weed germination part. If you germinate them in the ground, then the weeds and squash are going to germinate roughly at the same time. And then you will obviously have to carefully cultivate around them once they do come up. Then immediately when I transplant them, I cover the bed with insect netting. This isn't always necessary, to be sure, but better safe than sorry, in my opinion. Obviously, if you were going to irrigate from below, like with drip tape. Wet leaves bring fungal diseases, so overhead watering is not generally ideal, though 1 or 2 good overhead waterings a week won't hurt them terribly. Just make sure the water distribution is even, i.e. run the irrigation long enough to saturate the whole bed below the squash. Few crops can show poor distribution of water, quite like squash, with wonky fruit and lopsided plants, so if you see that, it's probably a water thing. Then to finally get to your question, yes, indeed, I take the cover off when I see the first female flowers or first flowers in general, really, but you can wait until you identify the females. That's fine. Doesn't matter. One note here is that not all insect netting is created equally. The lightest row covers can trap a lot of heat, so I prefer to use specially made insect netting. I've been using Protect Net from Johnny's for years. We bought a bunch of it not that long ago, but many growers that I know are starting to suggest Exclude Net instead, which I have not tried. I still have a ton of Protect Net, so I haven't needed to buy new insect netting. But anyway, the exclude net is supposedly more robust and will last you longer. I will post a link for that in the show notes. You can try it yourself. Now, in the early spring, of course, or in colder climates, perhaps the heat trapped from the lighter row covers is a boon. Here in Kentucky, it's more of a death trap than a boon after April, just because it gets too hot and humid. In the early spring, it's great. As soon as you get into that heat, not so good. So yeah, if you've done everything right and given them a favorable place to grow, they should be ready to outrun pests and rock and roll into the fruiting stage once you remove that insect netting. I hope that is helpful, and hopefully everyone can let us know how and if this helps with your squash production this season. Otherwise, it's a quick break time. Be right back.
Today's episode is brought to you by Good Agriculture. If you'd rather be on the farm than inside doing your taxes, you are not alone. Good Agriculture handles farm bookkeeping and tax filing, so there is no scrambling at tax time. They keep your books clean and up to date and show you where your farm's finances stand. If you're behind, they'll get you caught up. They also help farmers find funding and stay ahead of grant deadlines. You run the farm, they help the business. Learn more at goodagriculture.com/info. That's goodagriculture.com/info. All right, back to the show.
If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere the questions come in, but I will always get to those Patreon questions. Now, today's second Patreon question comes from Patreon member Adam Kinney, who writes, quote, I have several beds of romaine and buttercrunch under row cover. We have started to harvest both and have been finding both slugs and aphids on the heads of lettuce. I was thinking the row cover would eliminate this, but it has not. Any advice for preventing slugs? As a secondary question, our broccoli and cabbage are both under row cover and starting to grow into the row cover. I'd like to keep the row cover on as long as possible to help with bugs. We don't currently have insect cloth, and I was hoping to use row cover as insect cloth for as long as I can. How long can these crops be in contact with the row cover without creating a grow issue? End quote. Okay, so great. Thank you. A lot of fun questions here. So I have already done a few slug episodes that we will link in the show notes, but slug management really boils down to managing the environment and trapping the slugs. Those are kind of the two best options. In other words, keep the leaves as dry as possible, make sure your soil is operating at the highest level that you can, and use boards and beer traps to attract slugs and snails, etc., away from the crops. Then you can just kind of simply, remove the slugs from the garden by scraping them off of the board or chugging the beer. Kidding, just dump the beer out on an enemy. Row cover / insect netting alone will not always exclude those things. Aphids like squirrels and wind and American cheese are the absolute worst, and likewise will require a multi-pronged approach to deal with. I will at some point have an aphid expert on here to discuss more in depth what can be done to prevent aphids, but generally speaking, aphid management is about nutrient management and maybe even more so temperature management. Aphids are most abundant when air temps are relatively warm, but soil temps are still cool, like in the spring, or conversely, when soil temps are still warm, like in the fall, but air temps have started to drop, like somewhere around September, October here. So for that reason, you often see aphids the most in the spring and fall, and less so in the summer, in part based on the ambient temperatures and how that affects both plant and aphid biology. Aphids notably do tend to overwinter on plant debris, so make sure wherever you are planting, the plant debris is removed before covering that area with row cover so you don't inadvertently kind of lock them in with your plants. Also, of course, ants will bring aphids in to farm them, because we're not the only farmers on this property, as it turns out. For row cover, I would perhaps recommend adding it over top of the bed before you plant to start warming the soil. That may help prevent those aphids a little bit. That's anecdotal, but it could. Also, of course, with both ladybugs and slugs and pretty much all pests, you need some helpers. You need birds and beneficial insects. You need flowers to bring in those beneficials. This is partially why you tend to see more aphid damage inside of high tunnels than in the field. Natural predators are more able to keep them in check in the field than in a closed-off tunnel where they can't really access it either. In fact, one thing you could try on at least part of a lettuce crop is to take the row cover off the lettuce and see if better control is achieved with the aphids, because the insect netting will be keeping the good guys out as well. Like, they can't access the pests, they won't eat them. Now, to your question about contact with the row cover, well, that's generally up to you because cabbage and broccoli are not crops that require pollination. So long as the row cover is not too tight, they will produce a head whether they are covered or not. on like a fruiting crop. Like if you were covering your squash, for instance, you have to take that row cover off because at some point they're going to need pollinators to get in there and pollinate to create the squash. And cabbage worms can hatch in roughly a week. So if the crops are under, like a week from being harvested, you could take the row cover off, but the risk is there that the cabbage worms could spoil the party unless you're using Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a natural bacterium that helps explode worms. Yeah, or something like that. But if you just want to keep the row cover on and it was not too tight on the plants, they will still produce. One word of caution though, when it comes to row cover, especially in the spring as it gets hot, that row cover will, or at least could, dramatically overheat those brassicas on warm days. Insect netting's biggest value perhaps is protecting the plants while not holding in too much heat, if any, just depending on the type of insect netting that you're using. So as it warms up, you may be without a choice but to remove the row cover, or the plants will just suffer. It may not affect the plant growth directly from them touching it, but just the heat that's trapped in there won't be great for them. Anyway, I hope that was helpful.
Jayne, I know one of the things I don't really hear that much about when it comes to composting operations, especially larger scale ones, is pest management. And I'm curious, do composting operations on your scale have much in the way of pests, and what does that look like? And what would I mean, maybe there's some I'm not even thinking of.
Yes, for sure. We do have pests, and it's something I think about a lot. I think at this scale, a lot of composters' pests ends up being gulls. That's a big one. Like if you think of that when you go to a landfill, I don't know if it happens where you are, but we're on the coast. But
yeah, we don't have we don't have many. Every once in a while, I'll see a seagull and I know it's lost.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Okay. So yeah, we have gulls here. There's seagulls. For some reason, seagull is like not the proper term. It's gulls. My own ornithologist professor would be so scolding if I said seagull. So it's a gull. They're gulls. And what they just come here in the winter time, because in the summertime they're at the beach. And they're looking for the food scraps that come in and the fish scraps. And so I think almost for all the pests, there's other pests too, but there's a couple of tactics. If you make sure that you never have food scraps showing on the outside of the pile. So as soon as we get a load of food scraps, it's immediately covered with carbon, mixed, and then put away and then topped with more carbon. People call it a biofilter, but it's just more like leaves and wood chips on top. So it's always covered. That's going to prevent rodents, gulls, coyotes, crows, ravens. These are the things that like come up. Probably bears. I haven't had experience with bears, but I have talked to composters that that's a big concern. If bears are really a concern, they're going to dig in there. So you do need a fence in those areas. But for us, the main thing that we're thinking about is what is going to bring balance to that. So for gulls, we were like, okay, there's very few pests that can, or predators for gulls, but eagles are a predator of gulls. So, and some hawks, some of the bigger hawks. So we leave standing dead trees around the operation, around the farm, so that that's what those big, accipiters, the birds, the falcons, the hawks really like to come and land on so they can see. And so it looks almost looks like an eyesore keeping some standing dead trees, but they're very intentional. And you really do see those like hawks and eagles come in, land on there. And then it's a really amazing experience to watch an eagle come in and swoop down and take a gull. And then it does bring balance to that. It's the same thing with rodents. That's a really big concern for compost operators. And just making a habitat that rodents don't want to be in. So by turning regularly, that's disrupting their habitat, making sure there's no food scraps on the anywhere on the outside of the pile so they're not attracted to it. Encouraging like other life forms, like those hawks are going to do the same thing, take care of those rodents. So I really like the big bird life around the farm. Just thinking about what's their predator, what's going to bring them in, and just having people around a lot also discourages rodents. So that's that one. Flies are another concern. challenging. It's at every farm really that has horses and cows and things like that as well. Making sure you don't have standing puddles of water around, so they're not breeding. Making sure there's not food scraps and manure out and exposed. It's all the same answers. And turning those piles so you're not having, if a fly does get in there and land and lay eggs, if you're turning it, there's not a chance for the larvae to hatch. I don't know. I just like and plant habitat for birds. It's been incredibly effective to have hedgerows of elderberry and willow and the little scrubby pines and things around for birds to have nests in, and lots of food for them as well. Thinking about plants that have seeds to attract the birds to bring the population of flies down. So I don't know. That's my very long-winded answer again about using nature to bring balance to nature.
All right, I hope you all enjoyed that little compilation show. We should get back to our regular shows relatively soon, but I'm not going to rush my voice, obviously. So huge thanks for all of your patience. Don't forget, No Till Growers is a nonprofit 501c3. So donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow wherever you're getting this podcast. That is an easy way to help us out. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. And if you'd ever like to sponsor a show, you can reach out to Farmer Michelle at notillgrowers.com. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music, Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing, and getting all these sort of best of episodes together. And of course to my wife for absolutely everything in the world. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. Pick up a hat or a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, at notillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/notillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you sign up in the month of March, you generally get a shout out on the show, but we're going to hold off on shout outs until next week, when I will do a boatload of them probably and tell a new story as always and all that stuff, assuming that my voice returns. So stay tuned for that, the voice return. That should be fun. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for your patience. We'll see you all again soon. Have a great weekend. Much love. Bye.
You waited for your tax refund, now make it worth it. At Mattress Warehouse, save up to $850 during our tax refund sale. Plus, get a free adjustable base with select purchases. And sleep easy knowing your mattress is backed by our exclusive lifetime price guarantee. With 0% interest and free next day delivery, why shop anywhere else? Make your refund go farther at Mattress Warehouse. Visit mattresswarehouse.com today.
Hey, it's Cole Swindell, and when I spend 200 days a year rolling down the highway, the bus can start to feel smaller than a guitar case. Everyone wonders how I stay chill while the hours crawl by. Truth is, one good luck spin on Chumba, and suddenly the trip feels a whole lot shorter. Finding your space, even when there isn't much to spare. Need some chill? Let's Chumba.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus TNC Supply. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.